Các bạn đã dành thời gian tối mùng 3 Tết Nguyên đán để cùng trao đổi học thuật với giáo sư Ivana Hughes. Đây là lần thứ hai Book Hunter áp dụng format trao đổi trực tuyến cùng tác giả với sự trợ giúp của công nghệ dịch trực tiếp AI. Mặc dù AI còn xa mới có thể thay thế được con người, đặc biệt là những vấn đề về ngôn ngữ phức tạp như chính trị, lịch sử, văn hóa, nhưng cũng đáng để chúng ta thử nghiệm. Và Book Hunter hy vọng rằng mỗi tháng sẽ tổ chức một sự kiện giao lưu với tác giả trên toàn thế giới bằng hình thức này. Xin cảm ơn Ivana Hughes đã sẵn sàng chia sẻ với độc giả Book Hunter. Dù chúng tôi mới chỉ quen bà được một tháng qua sự giới thiệu của sử gia Peter Kuznick. Cảm ơn Peter đã kết nối và xin mời Ivana có thể giới thiệu đôi dòng về bản thân và lý do bà đến với công việc mà bà đang làm hiện nay.
Hello, everyone. It's such a pleasure to join you. For me, it's morning time. For you, it's late in the day. So thank you for being with all of us. My name is Ivana Nikolic Hughes. I serve as president of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation. This is a U.S. NGO or a nonprofit organization that's been in existence for now over 40 years, since 1982, with a kind of singular mission of educating and advocating for a just and peaceful world, and one that is free of nuclear weapons. So that question of nuclear weapons is going to be central to our conversation today. I also teach at Columbia University. My role at Columbia is as a senior lecturer in chemistry. So I come to all of this with both a background in science and a perspective of a scientist. I think actually nowadays Peter and I, so I'm glad Peter is here and that he introduced me to NAM and that I have the opportunity to be with all of you. We just recently wrote an article in which we talked about the fact that in the past, especially in the early decades of the nuclear age, many of the same scientists that were involved to various degrees with the development of nuclear weapons were also some of the first to sound the alarm about the danger of nuclear weapons. And that kind of advocacy continued for decades. I think it's lacking a little bit. And so in some sense, you know, my really sort of personal goal is to ensure that there is a scientific perspective that's represented to the extent I can contribute in some of these conversations, especially in policy circles. So maybe that's enough for the. I hope that's enough for the introduction, and maybe we can get started with the discussion. Let me know how that sounds.
Thank you, Ivana. Thank you for the short introduction. Hôm nay thì tôi sẽ bắt đầu với những 5 câu hỏi cho Ivana, và sau đó thì sau khi Ivana trả lời xong thì những người tham gia chương trình ngày hôm nay có thể tiếp tục đặt thêm câu hỏi dành cho bà. Và trước khi đi vào chương trình chính, nội dung chính là các câu hỏi, thì tôi mời các bạn chúng ta hãy thử cùng xem một đoạn video phim tài liệu nho nhỏ ngắn ngắn về thảm họa do bom nguyên tử gây ra.
A miniature sun, nearly 4 kilometers in diameter, blazing in the heart of a city for 10 seconds. That is what a nuclear explosion's fireball would feel like. This is actual footage from a nuclear test, where you can see how the paint on a school bus, positioned several kilometers from the fireball, ignites instantly from the intense heat. Imagine the damage such intense heat could inflict on human skin. Despite their immense destructive power, nuclear weapons are often referred to as weapons of peace. While this might
Vâng, chúng ta đã xem một đoạn rất là ngắn gọn về hình ảnh bom nguyên tử. Và rõ ràng rằng là có rất nhiều những người vô tội, chắc chắn là trong số họ có rất nhiều người không hề lựa chọn chiến tranh, cũng ghét chiến tranh như rất nhiều người dân yêu hòa bình khác trên thế giới. Nhưng một ngày nọ họ bỗng dưng trở thành nạn nhân của một chuỗi các hành động mà không phải do họ khởi xướng. Và chúng ta hy vọng rằng sẽ không bao giờ phải nhìn thấy cảnh xảy ra như trong video vừa rồi. Và bây giờ thì tôi xin phép được vào nội dung chính, đó là lần lượt gửi Ivana 5 câu hỏi. Câu hỏi đầu tiên dành cho Ivana: vũ khí hạt nhân đã trở thành chuẩn an ninh của thế giới hiện đại như thế nào? Và vì sao logic rande này vẫn tiếp tục được duy trì dù đầy rủi ro?
Thank you so much for that question. That's really the $1,000,000 question that we're dealing with. And thank you also for sharing the video. I think it's that's a really powerful demonstration of what just one nuclear weapon could do in a city. And I think just the idea that something like that could really happen at any moment in our world is absolutely unfathomable and absolutely unacceptable. And yet it's so much worse than just one bomb exploding in one city. So let me give a little bit of the history, and then I'll bring us to the present day. Last year, we commemorated 80 years of the nuclear age. And so in 1945, one country, the United States, had developed 3 nuclear warheads, 3 atomic bombs. One was tested in the desert of New Mexico on July 16th, and the other 2 were used in the well-known attacks on Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6th and August 9th, respectively. We now know that on the order of about 200,000 people died, either immediately or in the weeks and months following the attacks, and many continued to deal with illnesses, in some cases even to this day, radiation exposure-caused illnesses. But that was one country, 3 weapons, devastating consequences. Today, we have 9 countries, 9 states that possess on the order of 12,500 nuclear warheads. And most of these warheads are actually far more powerful than the bombs that were developed in 1945. Then it's often the comparisons are made to the Hiroshima bomb. And so we might have bombs that are dozens of times more powerful, or even hundreds of times more powerful. Back during the Cold War, during the nuclear testing period, the United States and the Soviet Union even tested bombs up to 1,000 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb, and the Soviets tested even more powerful bombs than that. So, back then, devastating consequences. Today, the stakes are so much higher because, unlike in 1945, it is widely thought and accepted that the use of a single nuclear weapon today would lead to a chain reaction that leads to a full-blown nuclear war. And where we are today with the 9 countries that possess nuclear weapons, and let me just state who they are. We have the United States, we have Russia, of course, Soviet Union developed those weapons, and Russia inherited them. We have the United Kingdom, France, China, Israel, India, Pakistan, and North Korea. And as I say all of those names, I think you'll recognize that all 9 of those countries are currently involved either in open conflict and warfare, or in long-standing tensions that maybe flare up from time to time, or have been dormant, but really been there for a long time. And that's precisely, in some sense, what makes, I think, today's moment so dangerous. For most of the first, let's call it 50 years of the nuclear age, so I'm just talking broadly from 1945 to 1995, for most of that time, the dominant threat in terms of nuclear weapons, in terms of nuclear war, was from the Cold War adversaries, the United States and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, I said, of course, the United States acquired nuclear weapons in 1945. I should just add that just 6 months after the attack on Nagasaki, so the second attack on a Japanese city, just 6 months later, on February 10th, the United States was in the Marshall Islands on Bikini Atoll in Bikini Island, speaking with the people of Bikini about taking their islands. They were told for a time, and planning nuclear testing. So there was absolutely no time between sort of the initial development, the use of the initial test, the use of the bombs, and sort of this recognition that this was going to be a program that just continues. So that was the United States in 1945. By 1949, the Soviet Union acquired their first nuclear weapons. And while it was in many ways lagging behind the United States, at least in the sheer numbers of weapons in the 50s and 60s, by the 1970s, it was catching up, achieving full parity in the size of the arsenal by 1980. As I said, they actually had some of the even more powerful weapons. So it's not all comparisons are in fact completely simple. And the Soviet Union actually exceeded the U.S. arsenal. By 1986, between the two countries, there was, depending on how you count, in the arsenal, 60 to 70,000 nuclear warheads. So the fact that today we have 12,500 can be considered both a great failure, and I certainly think that, but it also is a great success in that we actually came down from numbers. It will be this year, will be the 40 years since that absolute peak in the size of the nuclear arsenals. But just to again step back to that relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union, by the 1960s, the accepted doctrine was this mutually assured destruction. The idea that both sides, in fact, had enough capability to retaliate against one another in response to a first nuclear strike, such that both the attacker and the attacked would be annihilated. And this doctrine, this idea, was meant to dissuade either power from starting a nuclear war. I'll just add that regardless of what one could have done back in the day, and even to this, and even today, it was really always self-assured destruction, because there was never a way of making sure that you could attack in such a way that you wouldn't incur damage yourself. And by the damage, I don't just mean, the other would retaliate. I actually mean that the consequences of nuclear war are so severe, and I'll get into some of this in a moment. The consequences are so severe in things like nuclear winter, ozone layer destruction, radiation fallout spreading globally, that you quite simply could never avoid your own self-destruction, even if you actually succeeded in somehow disarming and paralyzing your adversary. But just back to, this was sort of the reigning, thinking of the day, mutually assured destruction. That's what's going to save the world. And what we now know is that during that period, there were dozens of incidents involving US and Soviet nuclear weapons that could have led not just to nuclear weapons being used, but potentially to a full-blown nuclear war. Not to mention just even individual singular catastrophes like this, the brief video showing what would happen if a single nuclear weapon explodes somewhere. So just to mention a few of these, and if people are interested, you can sort of learn more and look them up. The Cuban Missile Crisis had both elements of there was a potential both for deliberate use that would have been, ordered by one of the two sides and started nuclear war, but also for a kind of accidental or mistaken use of a nuclear weapon in a crisis situation. There were also just complete and sheer accidents, things like a U.S. and a Soviet submarine colliding, nuclear warheads dropping from planes in Spain, in Greenland, here in the United States, in South Carolina, in someone's backyard, in North Carolina, in a field. And there were something people call close calls. You could sort of, brand them not quite accidental, not quite just like a mistake, but more along the lines of a miscalculation. There was something called the Able Archer crisis. This was in 1983. It was a NATO exercise that NATO had sort of made the exercise more realistic relative to exercises they had previously done. And the Soviets quite simply thought that this was the real thing, that NATO was preparing for nuclear war. And so they started loading their nuclear warheads on their planes. And somehow the whole thing was, resolved before it actually became nuclear war. But it was thought to have been very, very close. And in that same year, 1983, there was a very famous nuclear false alarm incident where a Soviet officer had received signals of 5 incoming missiles from the United States heading towards the Soviet Union. And later it turned out that those signals were a result of an alignment between clouds and satellites, something that was later sort of dealt with through the computer programs that were being used, but just demonstrates how easily something and really the word catastrophic doesn't quite do it justice, but apocalyptic, I think is a better word. Could have happened. So this idea, this sort of mutually assured destruction or nuclear deterrence, that these things are what saved us, I think is very, very, very misleading. So let me just say, take a brief moment to say what I mean when I talk about apocalyptic. So I already mentioned, so in these in a nuclear war scenario, and I'm just going to take the example of India and Pakistan for the moment, which have relatively small nuclear arsenals, maybe on the order of 100 to 150 nuclear warheads each, relatively small yields compared to what's out there, especially in the arsenals of the United States and Russia. If India and Pakistan were to engage in what's referred to as a limited regional nuclear war, in that war, there would be on the order of 130 million people dying just from the attacks. And that's, of course, absolutely horrendous and unimaginable. But it's the global impacts that really makes this, as we say, apocalyptic. One of those impacts is nuclear winter. Nuclear winter is something we've known about since the early 1980s. It's the idea that if something like nuclear war takes place and there are fires in cities or from military installations, wherever the attacks occur, such widespread fires, such heat, you saw in the video, that fireball is as hot as the sun itself. So it's like bringing a little sun on the earth for a limited period of time, but that's going to cause a lot of fires. And those fires are going to release soot into the atmosphere. The soot is going to block incoming sunlight. Just like here in New York this morning, it's a very cloudy day. The clouds are blocking incoming sunlight. That's why it's not a bright day. The soot would block incoming sunlight for years. And what that would do is it would drop temperatures around the planet to such a degree that food growth would begin to fail. Agriculture would begin to collapse, and people around the world would begin to starve. We actually know about such miniature effects from volcanic eruptions. The year 1815 is considered the year without a summer. It was due to a large volcanic eruption. Volcanic eruptions do not produce the same amount of food as a full-blown nuclear war would. And so the estimates for this nuclear winter are far larger than what can happen from the kinds of volcanic eruptions we've dealt with throughout history. And the estimates are that, and this is a study that was published in 2022. In that study, the worldwide population used was 7 billion people. And according to that study, more than 2 billion out of 7 billion people would die of starvation within 2 years of a nuclear war between India and Pakistan. And I would just add that now on the planet, we actually have more than 8 billion people, which suggests that there would be more than 3 billion people dying of starvation. So this is absolutely why this is not just an issue that people should care in the countries that have nuclear weapons. It's not just an issue that people should care if, their cities might be attacked. It's an issue that absolutely all of us should care about. So let me just say just a couple of things about nuclear deterrence specifically. I think that for me, the first step in getting us out of the mess that we're in, and we really are in a mess, and I'm happy to comment on some of even just the most immediate recent events that pertain to these questions. But to me, the very first step is acknowledging the enormous threat that nuclear weapons pose to our world. We just cannot continue to sit here hoping we continue to be lucky as we know we've been, throughout the Cold War. There is less information about the things that have gone wrong since the end of the Cold War, but we're pretty sure that some things have gone wrong since the end of the Cold War. That just has to do with declassification of materials and so on. And the second piece, I think what we've really been dealing with, especially, so I talked a little bit about the Cold War. Then there was a moment in 1986, simultaneously, peak of nuclear arsenals, and at the same time, Gorbachev and Reagan met in Reykjavik that year, in October of that year, and both leaders were gravely concerned about nuclear weapons. Gorbachev was very moved by the US public opinion, by things like the 1982 Central Park rally, where 1 million people, mostly Americans, but also from other countries, protested against nuclear weapons. And interestingly, Reagan seems to have really been shaken in 1983, not by the incidents, mind you, that I told you, but by a film called The Day After, that sort of convinced him that we had to do something about nuclear weapons. Those two leaders got together and almost agreed to eliminate nuclear weapons. I mean, where we would have been, now for almost 40 years later, it's just, it's so sad that didn't happen. They ended up having a disagreement about U.S. plans to develop strategic defense, and those plans were sort of ludicrous and all of that. But even though they didn't eliminate nuclear weapons, and when the sort of Cold War officially ended, the Soviet Union was disbanded, there really was a moment where we did have success. We did bring numbers down, again, from 60, 70,000 to 12,500 today. And yet, at the same time, we didn't do enough to really continue to make the general public aware of the threat that nuclear weapons pose. If anything, we turned the narrative completely and turned the narrative into nuclear weapons have kept the peace. Not that narrative wasn't present in the Cold War, but somehow at the same time that people stopped being so worried about nuclear weapons, and even in some sense their existence was kind of swept under a rug, there was this kind of renewal of nuclear weapons are a good thing. And of course the sad realization is that we've had numerous wars. I don't have to tell people in Vietnam about this, about the millions that have died in your own country in a war that spanned 2 decades, and millions that have died. On one count, I calculated something like on the order of 30 million people dying in wars, in conflicts around the world since 1945. That's not peace. That's not, that's not the kind of planet we actually really want to live on. And at the same time, not only have we had these conflicts, but for the things that have been good, I don't think we can attribute them to nuclear weapons. I think that there's so much else that has happened on the planet. The development of science and technology and communication and means of travel and all sorts of things. I mean, just the fact that I'm totally touched by the fact that I'm able to speak with you today about these issues. You're in Vietnam, I'm in New York. I mean, who would have thought, right? That something like that would be possible. And yet here we are. And so, to somehow assign nuclear weapons this good role in the world and yet not acknowledge the contribution of other things that may have, to the extent that our world in some ways has become better, that may have contributed. I think it is, I think this has been the really, really, really harmful narrative. I'll just say a couple more things about nuclear deterrence. It assumes rational actors we actually know this. This is sort of like in economics, it has had for decades been assumed that humans behave rationally when it comes to economic decisions. And that has now been completely dismantled in a field called neuroeconomics, which has demonstrated study after study that people behave irrationally for all sorts of reasons and under all kinds of circumstances. But even if we did really have rational leaders, and I have to say, I don't have a lot of confidence in really any of the 9 leaders. Nothing personal about any specific one, but these are human beings. And even if really they were supremely rational and they would make whatever the right decision is, we could have a glitch. As AI, there are, of course, efforts to curtail the role of AI in nuclear command and control decisions, but there's no doubt that the presence of AI might speed up some decision making, shortening the timeline, making any of this more likely faster, and so on. So I think what we have to do is recognize the history, recognize that even if we do accept nuclear deterrence as something that will prevent, for example, widespread conflict, it could fail. And any failure having to do with nuclear weapons would be, as I've been saying, not just catastrophic, but apocalyptic. And so that, I think that's where for me, the key issue is dismantling that narrative and moving forward towards really the only solution to, as I've said, the mess we find ourselves in, being the elimination of nuclear weapons. So let me stop there.
Thank you, Ivana. Thank you for the answer very in detail. And for the second question, câu hỏi thứ hai, hệ thống chính trị, pháp lý quốc tế hiện nay đang hỗ trợ hay cản trở tiến trình giải trừ hạt nhân?
Yes, no, thank you so much. So where are we today in terms of international agreements? So I'll just mention 4 agreements that have really, I think, played a key role in curtailing at least the role of nuclear weapons. And you know, people often talk about it, especially specifically when it comes to the United States, to the United Nations, about, you know, the United Nations, you know, hasn't quite brought us to a world that we need to be in. I would argue that the United Nations has helped prevent us from being in a world that we don't want to be in, which would be a world in which nuclear war happens, in a world, you know, that quite simply ends. And so, to the extent I want to recognize that the existing international treaties have been successful to various degrees, but to the extent that we are still here, that we're still, you know, able to discuss this, that, you know, I do this work because I do hope that we can and will eliminate nuclear weapons. I do think those international agreements have played a large role. So I'll focus on the international ones. There have been others, including most specifically bilateral agreements between the United States and the Soviet Union initially, and now Russia. One of those agreements, New START, expired just 2 weeks ago. This is really part of the reason why I'm sort of highlighting that we're in a particularly grave moment. But I personally think that regardless of what the U.S. and Russia need to do, and they do need to do a lot, in fact, the most, just because they have most of the world's nuclear weapons. Nearly 90% of the 12,500 are in the possession of U.S. and Russia. Still, to me, the important thing is to bring all UN member states together to eliminate nuclear weapons. I think that still has to be the goal. So let me just tell you very briefly about the 4 agreements. We had in the 1960s the Partial Test Ban Treaty. This was negotiated by the U.S. President John F. Kennedy and his Soviet counterpart Nikita Khrushchev. This was an agreement reached in 1963. Negotiated and entered into force. The UK participated as well in the negotiations. It's an agreement that bans nuclear testing in the atmosphere, underwater, and in outer space. It was a really important achievement back then. As I said, the US had tested in the Marshall Islands, a bomb called the Castle Bravo, which was 1,000 Hiroshima bomb equivalents. This was a bomb whose mushroom cloud was 40 kilometers high, and it was nearly 100 kilometers wide. So the mushroom cloud that you see, 100 kilometers wide and 40 kilometers high, just absolute monstrosity. And again, the Soviets were also testing extremely even more powerful bombs as well. The UK was testing hydrogen bombs, and so on. That treaty, again, China and France ended up testing in the atmosphere after 1963. They actually, neither China nor France ever joined this treaty, but I would still say their testing was more limited than what had been done previously, especially by the United States and the Soviet Union. North Korea also never joined this treaty. And yet it really did change the conversation on, at the very least, testing in the atmosphere. Then later in that same decade, we had the negotiations were really long-standing, but culminated in 1968 with the signing of an agreement, and it entered into force in 1970. This is the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and this is the treaty that we still have today. Today, there are 190 states parties to this treaty, 188 UN member states, and 2 observers. So it's not just one of the largest arms control agreements, it's one of the largest international agreements, period. This agreement aimed to have 5 countries recognized as nuclear weapon states. That was US, Soviet Union, now Russia, China, United Kingdom, and France, and everybody else committing to not acquiring nuclear weapons. That part of the treaty is referred to as non-proliferation. And then in sort of recognition of the non-nuclear weapon states agreeing not to proliferate, not to acquire nuclear weapons, the so-called grand bargain was that they would all have access to peaceful uses of nuclear energy, and that the nuclear weapon states would actually disarm. And we are now 55 years plus past the entry into force of this agreement. Not only have some countries not joined, primarily and most importantly, the other nuclear armed states, India, Israel, Pakistan, and North Korea, but also this agreement has not lived up to, although it's lived up reasonably, I would say, to its non-proliferation sort of pillar. It's also lived up reasonably to the peaceful use pillar. However much, whatever one might think about nuclear energy, where it has really utterly failed is the disarmament pillar. And that, I think, is a key point of contention at this moment with the NPT. And then there's the third agreement that aimed to expand on the initial agreement on the partial test ban treaty. That's the comprehensive test ban treaty, which bans all nuclear explosions, whether for military or civilian purposes, underground, not just in the atmosphere, but underground as well. This one opened for signatures in 1996 and has yet to enter into force. And the reason is that several of the key states that are supposed to ratify it have not done so. So currently there are 177 ratifications of this treaty. Russia used to be a state party, but withdrew in 2023, I want to say, when it was seeking parity with the United States. The United States signed this agreement. President Bill Clinton signed this agreement, but never, it was never ratified. Ratification is like a step that's typically done in the national legislature. In the U.S., the 2/3 of the Senate would have to vote in support of the agreement in order for it to be ratified. Besides the U.S., China, Egypt, Iran, and Israel have also signed but not ratified this treaty. And India, North Korea, and Pakistan never even signed it. So this is one that I think has helped with the norm of not testing nuclear weapons, but it has certainly not eliminated it. Of course, North Korea, both India and Pakistan in the late 1990s conducted nuclear tests, and then North Korea is the only country to have conducted nuclear tests in this century. And I think part of something that's really quite upsetting, quite recent actually, is President Trump openly discussing the resumption of nuclear testing. And this is a problem on so many levels, including, I just want to say that the nuclear testing that did take place, again, up until 1963 in the partial test ban treaty, but beyond that as well, both underground in countries that banned the atmospheric testing, but also in the atmosphere elsewhere, that entire period, over 2,000 nuclear tests were conducted, and that entire period really just led to such widespread devastation and very severe, devastating humanitarian consequences, primarily on communities living nearby and downwind of the nuclear tests. But really what we're now aware of is even the global consequences of this. And so those are the three agreements. The last one I'll just mention is the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. This is a treaty that was negotiated. This is the most recent treaty, also the most ambitious one. This is a treaty that bans any and all activities having to do with nuclear weapons. It was negotiated in 2017. It entered into force in 2021. Vietnam is not just a party to this treaty, it's one of the first 10 states to ratify it. So I think you should all be very, very proud of your country for being a champion of a treaty that quite simply recognizes the devastating humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons and aims to address them head on. At this time, there are 75 states parties to the treaty and another 74 states parties to the treaty and another 25 states that have signed it but not yet ratified it. Also, at the United Nations in UN General Assembly, when resolutions are passed in support of this treaty, typically on the order of 120 states vote in support of the resolution. So there's a kind of support for the treaty in well over half of all UN member states. But of course, that's one process and one way in which the international community can put pressure on the nuclear armed states. But we also need, pressure from within those states to get them to the table where they discuss these issues, not just amongst themselves, but also with the states. Because as I said before, everybody has a stake in this. This is not quite simply something that will only impact nuclear armed states. This is something nuclear war is something that would have impact on globally, on people everywhere. And that's quite simply why we have to pursue this at the international level. I'll just add one more thing about the United Nations. The very first resolution in the United Nations General Assembly in 1946, January of 1946, was about control of nuclear weapons, was about what needed to be done in the nuclear age. So this really has been a long-standing issue for the United Nations and for the global community. And this is, what's so impressive and I think inspiring about that vision of the people who recognized the atrocities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and realized something had to be done about these weapons, is that they had the foresight to see just how much of a threat these weapons were from the very beginning, long before we understood nuclear winter, or I didn't even mention the ozone layer destruction, all of the radiation effects and so on of nuclear weapons. So anyway, we are, I would say today we're not in a good place, but it isn't like we have nowhere to turn to. And I really very much believe in the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons just being, in some sense, both the first step, like you have to recognize what your ultimate goal is with these weapons, but also in many ways the very last step, like something has to happen between the nuclear armed states in the meantime. But at the very end, we would have the TPNW, that's the short for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, to sort of bring everybody together and to achieve that world free of nuclear weapons. I also often talk about that meeting in Reykjavik between Gorbachev and Reagan, where they had almost agreed to eliminate nuclear weapons. Had something like that happened in a world in which the TPNW existed, I think we would have been in much better shape, because then there would have been kind of a decision between the two leaders that the international community could have absorbed and turned into action and turned a world free of nuclear weapons a reality. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, cảm ơn Ivana. Vậy chúng ta đến câu hỏi thứ ba. Với các quốc gia nhỏ và đang phát triển và yêu hòa bình như Việt Nam thì rủi ro nằm ở đâu và cần chuẩn bị như thế nào?
Yeah, so I think I addressed some of this already. Let me just underscore the points. Everybody has a stake in this conversation. I talked about some of these environmental consequences, nuclear winter, ozone layer destruction, radiation impacts. We have I would say today, a rather poor understanding of how the current levels of globalization would, how that would intersect with a nuclear war. But it's pretty clear that, if a nuclear war occurred, let's say between the United States and Russia, as I had said, I gave you some of the numbers on India and Pakistan. In the case of United States and Russia using 1/3 of their current arsenals, what we're looking at is on the order of 360 million people dying in the attacks. And then we're looking at 5 out of 7 billion people on the planet dying of starvation. So I would argue, or it's really more than 5 out of 7, so more than 6 out of 8 billion people. So an absolute collapse just from that nuclear winter impact. But really think of how globally interconnected societies are now in terms of economy, in terms of trade, financial systems, all of this. Again, we don't have, I would say, an excellent understanding of how nuclear war would impact this, but it's clear the collapse would be an absolute feature of, what happens, even if for a country like Vietnam, the actual explosions are really, really far away. I should say that the UN currently has a panel of experts that are looking at exactly this issue. So this is definitely something we will be learning more about over time. But just to kind of get back, okay, Vietnam has a stake in this. Vietnam, as I said, is a state party to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Playing a key role there is absolutely essential. Vietnam actually this year holds the presidency for the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference. So I told you this treaty entered into force in 1970. After that, every 5 years, there has been a review conference. The last one was supposed to take place in 2020, but because of COVID, it was moved all the way to 2022. And that review conference was the 10th NPT review conference. Now, this year, 2026, and what they're aiming to do is get back onto the, 5-year schedule. But so the 11th is this year in 2026. The 12th will be in 2030, and then it will be again 2035, 2040, and so on. So this, at the end of April 27th to May 22nd, there will be here in New York at the United Nations, the NPT 11th Review Conference, and Vietnam holds the presidency of that. And this is going to be a really challenging conference. I think part of the reason is that the Trump administration is just so has been very oppositional to UN efforts broadly, but certainly to UN efforts focused on nuclear weapons as well. Back in 2017, that was during the first Trump administration. Nikki Haley was Trump's ambassador to the UN. And during the negotiations of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, there was a kind of infamous press conference that Nikki Haley held outside of the conference room where the TPNW was being negotiated, where she talked about how, all of us, the good guys, we would love to get rid of our nuclear weapons, but the bad guys have them, so we have to keep ours. I mean, it was absolutely ludicrous. So the part of the challenge will be just the Trump administration being so opposed to, international cooperation through international agreements generally, and specifically on nuclear weapons. Part of the challenge is the ongoing war in Ukraine, where, of course, Russia has nuclear weapons, but Ukraine's allies and to the extent that NATO has been backing Ukraine in that conflict, and various countries individually through military, financial, and other aid that also have nuclear weapons. So again, we haven't had, thank goodness, the use of a nuclear weapon in that conflict, but that nuclear weapons have been sort of a cloud hanging over that conflict the entire time. And sadly, we're not seeing, an end, although reports of continued negotiations come up every so often. Then there's the Middle East. Israel is not just one of the 4 countries that are not party to the NPT, but have nuclear weapons. It's also the only one that has what's referred to as a policy of ambiguity. They actually don't admit that they have nuclear weapons. Everybody else admits they have nuclear weapons. Israel does not. And now, of course, we know about the conflict and the tensions with Iran, is specifically with regard to Iran's nuclear program. It's all some of this is I would say very ironic, because it's Israel, which has nuclear weapons but doesn't admit that they have nuclear weapons, accusing Iran, which does not have nuclear weapons, of wanting to get nuclear weapons. That accusation has been going on really for decades. My sense is that if Iran actually wanted to have nuclear weapons, they would have had them a long time ago. So that they certainly have had that capability. The JCPOA, the agreement between the United States and Iran and Europeans and so on, had put some dents and limits in Iran's ability to acquire nuclear weapons, but of course the Trump administration left that as well. Another piece of why this NPT is going to be so contentious and difficult is that, of course, the agreement on limits to both nuclear weapons arsenals, deployed nuclear warheads, as well as delivery vehicles. The last agreement between the U.S. and Russia, this is called New START. It was an agreement that was negotiated in 2010 between President Obama and his Russian counterpart at the time, Medvedev. The two of them negotiated that in 2010, signed it in 2011. The agreement lasted for 10 years and was then in 2021 extended for another 5 years. The idea then would have been to have an even better, more ambitious replacement agreement by the time that the current one would expire, which just happened 2 weeks ago. And none of that happened. In last September, President Putin had offered to extend the agreement for another year, but the United States never actually issued a formal response. At one point, President Trump said something like, if it expires, it expires. And actually, Katrina vanden Heuvel, who's the publisher of The Nation, it's a progressive magazine in the United States, actually the oldest progressive magazine in the United States. She wrote an article on this and said, if it expires, it expires. Sounds like he's talking about, a carton of milk rather than like the agreement in arms control, the last standing arms control agreement between the United States and Russia. So all of these things are making the current moment really challenging. All of these things are going to make the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty Review Conference really challenging. The past two conferences, so both the conference in 2015 and the conference in 2022, ended without what's called an agreement, a kind of a consensus document that all the countries agreed to without any objections. And I would say we're in a far worse place today than we were in either 2015 or 2022. Again, Vietnam holds the presidency of this. It's an extremely admirable thing to do, especially in such challenging times. I think my advice to the diplomats would be to be as ambitious and as focused on the well-being of humanity and the safety on our planet as much as they can, and to seek agreement wherever it can be found. I think that just from a broader perspective, not just the NPT specifically, one of the things that we know from history is that really, really challenging times are also times of opportunity. There are also times where new ideas and new thinking and kind of paradigm shifts can happen. And I think that this really may be such a time. I also think, and I know we'll get into this in a couple of your other questions, but this notion that the general public needs to be aware of this, needs to understand these issues, needs to really understand what's at stake when we talk about nuclear weapons. I think that will greatly help the cause. I kind of see it as these two different spheres. One is sort of diplomatic, and that's where, we have to keep pushing and pushing and pushing. But the other is the sphere of interacting with the general public, which, of course, again, is why I'm so grateful for the opportunity to speak with all of you. So let me stop there on this question.
Cảm ơn Ivana. Tôi muốn nhắn gửi với các bạn đang có mặt ở trong Meet ngày hôm nay, đấy là các bạn có thể gõ câu hỏi vào phần chat hoặc là chuẩn bị sẵn câu hỏi để sau đó sau hai câu hỏi tới đây thì các bạn có thể đặt câu hỏi trực tiếp với Ivana. Bây giờ đến câu hỏi số 4. Vai trò của tiếng nói phản chiến trong bối cảnh này là gì? Từ góc nhìn lịch sử thì phản chiến không chỉ là lập trường đạo đức mà còn là một lực lượng xã hội có thể tác động lên lựa chọn quốc gia, đặc biệt là khi chiến tranh và can thiệp quân sự luôn để lại hệ quả dài hạn vượt khỏi tính toán ban đầu.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I mean, I think, being anti-war and speaking against war has never been popular, in particular in the United States. I was recently talking to actually a group last week. They're called Massachusetts Peace Action, and one of the people involved in the group, I actually presented a webinar there, and they wanted me to speak specifically about the war in Ukraine. And I talked about some of the challenges of speaking against that war and just the kind of narrative that gets used when people try to present some very factual things related to the war and how you get attacked and you get called, a Putin apologist, and you get called a Russian stooge and all kinds of things, all very reminiscent of all kinds of attacks during the Cold War, whether it was specifically on the Vietnam War, whether it was specifically on advocating for nuclear disarmament. Back then that was all pro-communist. Here at Columbia, I mentioned I teach at Columbia University. In 1968, we had some of the first and most widespread student protests against the war in Vietnam. They actually lasted for weeks. The university was shut down, and ultimately the students occupied 5 buildings, and ultimately the university called the police, and there were 700 arrests and really violent arrests at the time. So I live in the shadow. I was born in the 70s, so I was born in 1976, so a year after the war ended. But I think so many people still kind of live in that shadow. I've also, in the U.S., I've really had the pleasure, especially since my involvement at the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, which I began in my role there as president in 2022, so just a few years ago. And in that involvement, I've really gotten to know many people who are older than me and who were either Vietnam veterans, so people who had been to Vietnam, or people who were conscientious. Some of the very first, in fact, the founder of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, his name was David Krieger. He passed away in 2023. He and his family believe that he was the first registered conscientious objector to the Vietnam War. But anyway, back to my story about the Massachusetts Peace Action Group and the webinar I gave there. The person, in response to some of what I was saying, the person said, well, every war is, it's okay to speak against the war after it ends, right? So the difficult time is being anti-war while a war is going on, and many people have put their lives, their reputations, their jobs in this country. Again, the culture of protest that arose during the Vietnam War was extremely strong, and there was some of that with the Iraq War, and obviously some of that since October 7th, protests against what was happening in Gaza. But it's never been popular. It's never been mainstream. It's always been, in some sense, ridiculed. There is a word that is meant to, in some sense, be derogatory about anti-war, people who are anti-war. And that word is peacenik. It's sort of meant to be kind of dismissive of such efforts. I do want to read to you the words of somebody who was anti-war, but who we don't often associate with that. And those are the words of Albert Einstein. So a man who was in 1999 pronounced by Time magazine in the United States as the man of the 20th century. Here's what he wrote in an essay published by a Japanese magazine, I believe in 1952. So I'm going to read to you just a few sentences. Here's Albert Einstein talking about the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. My participation in the production of the atomic bomb consisted in a single act. I signed a letter to President Roosevelt. This letter stressed the necessity of large-scale experimentation to ascertain the possibility of producing an atom bomb. I was well aware of the dreadful danger for all mankind if these experiments would succeed. But the probability that the Germans might work on that very problem with good chance of success prompted me to take that step. I did not see any other way out, although I always was a convinced pacifist. And now for the sentence, to kill in wartime, it seems to me, is in no ways better than common murder. So I also was speaking to a group in December, to a group of high school science and math teachers from New York City public schools. And I actually did a series of workshops for them. So we talked all about the science of nuclear weapons, all kinds of other things. But at one point, I actually had them read an even longer excerpt and then discuss amongst each other the Einstein quotes. And one of the teachers, after they had read them, one of the teachers raised her hand and said, "Why do we never hear about this Einstein?" Right? And it's true. It's not just him. We don't hear about we don't hear about the regular peace activists, the people who put their lives on the line, who protest, who organize, who reach out to their elected leaders on these issues and so on. But we also don't hear about celebrities who actually, voice their opinions or discuss these issues from a anti-war, pro-peace perspective. And I'll just add that I think we even hear less and less from them in the day of social media. I think there's even more of a fear in speaking out because people don't want to be taken out of context. They don't want to be canceled. They don't want to be accused of various things. But I quite simply can't see anything more noble than being against war, being against killing, and in the case of nuclear weapons, being against the ultimate possible destruction to humanity, to our beautiful planet, and to really potentially all life on the planet. So let me stop there as well.
Cảm ơn Ivana. Vâng, tôi xin phép được dừng những câu hỏi của bản thân tôi và cảm ơn bà đã chia sẻ những hiểu biết của bà về những câu hỏi vừa rồi. Tôi xin phép được chuyển qua dành cơ hội cho các bạn tham gia hôm nay đặt câu hỏi cho bà. Và đây tôi thấy là có 2 câu hỏi đã được gửi, thì không biết là Ivana có nhìn thấy ở phần tin nhắn không ạ?
Yeah, are they're in English? Let me just, yes.
It's in English. If you don't mind, I can read it out to you.
Yeah. No, it's in English. It's perfect. Yeah, I'm happy if you read it because it's going to take me time to read. But maybe just everyone can hear you pose the question, and then I can answer. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for your insightful sharing. So I have 2 questions. So one about the U.S. and Iran, and the other one is about Ukraine. The first one, last year the USA attacked Iran to prevent their development of nuclear weapons. That is the claim, despite little evidence. And now there are more concerns that the U.S. will continue to attack Iran soon. So you can see on the news recently and yesterday until now. So I'm thinking that is the nuclear weapons still the blame, or the intention of the USA trying to replace the current regime? That is the first one. The second one is about Ukraine. In the past.
What did I answer? Is it okay if I answer? Let me answer the Iran question, and then we can tackle Ukraine. This is really an excellent question. Whether this whole time this accusation of developing nuclear weapons has been used really as an excuse for whatever the United States and Israel, I would say, have been wanting to do with respect to Iran and the current regime, in particular, pursuing regime change, as has happened really all too many times. One of the things, I used to know the exact number, but I think in 2023, Iran was subject to something like more than 20% of all IAEA. IAEA is the International Atomic Energy Agency based in Vienna, which wasn't established due to the NPT. It was already in existence, but basically took the role of the watchdog that was going to ensure that proliferation wasn't happening and peaceful use of nuclear energy. So this interplay between a country having a nuclear energy program for, again, peaceful purposes, but that wasn't being diverted into developing nuclear weapons. And, Iran has been a party to the NPT. They were subject to many inspections. Again, I think something like over 20% of all IAEA inspections in a given year, whereas they have just a couple of percent, in terms of the number of facilities compared to worldwide facilities. So they were certainly subject to inspections. The JCPOA, which again, the Trump administration just tore up, that agreement, I think, would have done a lot more had it stayed in place to preventing Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. It's not that, so from my perspective, I actually really fundamentally disagree with that, the quote from Nikki Haley that I referred to. I think nuclear weapons are bad in any hands because they could, whether the leaders are good or bad, they could still end up being used. They could still lead to catastrophic and even apocalyptic consequences. So I think, to me, the problem isn't Iran per se. The problem are nuclear weapons. Of course, I don't want Iran to acquire nuclear weapons, but I don't think that's what if that had been the goal, then staying with the JCPOA would have been a much better strategy than where we are today. Again, up until now, I would say there's no evidence that Iran wants to acquire a nuclear bomb. But if I don't know, if that regime feels that the only way to protect themselves is to acquire nuclear weapons, who's to say that they won't do that? They say they don't want to do that, but again, I don't think we know. And the point there is that what's not working in the world today is this idea that on the one hand, the 5 or 9 nuclear armed states, the 5 recognized by the NPT and the 9 that all possess nuclear weapons, on the one hand, they don't want anyone else acquiring nuclear weapons. Certainly the 5, right? No one else is supposed to have nuclear weapons, but for them, nuclear weapons keep them safe. That is quite simply unsustainable. Either you think that everyone should have, that nuclear weapons keep countries safe, and then the next logical step is either everyone should have them or no one should have them, right? Or you work towards disarmament in a very serious manner and say, look, we're getting rid of our nuclear weapons. Don't acquire them yourself because 1, they're too costly. 2, they're not useful. Again, you all know the U.S. maybe wasn't involved for the full 2 decades, but it was involved for a good part of those 2 decades. It wasn't like nuclear weapons were the usable thing that was going to help them win the war in Vietnam. So I think the strategy, if you don't want other countries to acquire nuclear weapons, you can't keep holding on to yours as the source of peace and safety and security and so on. That is where we have this fundamental disagreement. It's not just about bad actors. It's about the weapons themselves. And it's about also, and even probably first and foremost, adherence to international law. We have a beautiful UN charter. If you ever get a chance to read the UN charter, I would really encourage you to do it. It's all there. It's all there. There's nothing, we don't need to invent new things. We just need to stick to the UN Charter. And that is something that we have most certainly not done. Again, just, speaking for my own country, the United States has violated the UN Charter, I would say, even just in the last year. More than once, certainly. And we have to get to a point where UN member states treat each other with respect and dignity and recognize each other's sovereignty, and resolve disagreements through peaceful means and negotiations and diplomacy, rather than through conflict and militarization, war, etc. Yeah, so let's do the second question on Ukraine.
Yes, thanks very much. I think that part of that you already answered on my second question, but then let me read it out. So we know about Ukraine. So before, Ukraine owned nuclear power, but then it had to give up from Soviet period, to get the nuclear protection, the USA, UK, and Russia. And unfortunately, like in 2023, so Ukraine got attacked by Russia. So even like Putin, many countries, they frustrated because Russia didn't respect their own word. So, for example, like Finland and Sweden, right after that, joined NATO for defense. So, right now we have like 9 countries on Earth having nuclear weapons. So, how can we achieve the world without that destructive power? So we know, for example, Pakistan and North Korea consider nuclear weapons very essential to their region's existence against outside threat.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is very much related. I'll just say a couple of things that are specific to the Ukraine question. So one thing I would say is the Ukraine and Kazakhstan and Belarus really didn't give up their own nuclear weapons. They had Soviet nuclear weapons, which were essentially entirely under Russian control on their territories. So those agreements were very important because those arsenals were actually quite large, and it was important to secure them. These were actually examples where the United States and Russia and those former Soviet republics, now independent UN member states, cooperated to ensure that the arsenals were. But it's not the same thing as one of the 9 nuclear armed states that possess nuclear weapons today giving up their arsenal. The only country that actually did something like that was South Africa. South Africa did develop nuclear weapons and did give them up at the end of apartheid and when Nelson Mandela came into power. So they actually are the only ones who in fact gave up a nuclear arsenal. So their historic case is I think a good example of how kind of inspiring example of how we could go down that path. So, on the one hand, I don't accept that Ukraine had nuclear weapons. They really didn't. On the other hand, I would just kind of repeat this. Really, it all, is downstream from the nuclear deterrence claims, which is our nuclear weapons keep us safe. Well, if that is so, then everybody should have nuclear weapons. And that, of course, is preposterous. That was something that John F. Kennedy talked about in 1963. He was worried that we would have 15 or 20 or 25 nuclear weapons within a decade or two, nuclear armed states within a decade or two. And he was right to be worried about that. And I do, as critical as I am of the NPT not achieving its disarmament obligations, I also very much recognize that it did help us to ensure that we didn't get to. Thank goodness we don't have 20 nuclear armed states today. But again, in some sense, just non-proliferation, just saying North Korea can't have them or shouldn't have them, or Iran can't have them or shouldn't have them, without disarmament on the part of the states that have nuclear weapons already, that doesn't work. It's not going to work. It's not going to continue working indefinitely. Other countries will get the idea that maybe, for their own, independence preservation, regime preservation, they want nuclear weapons. And secondly, if we don't get back, not get back, I don't think we ever really had kind of reverence for international law, but without getting to a point where international law is sacrosanct and is applied, and not applied, the rules-based order. The Canadian Prime Minister talked about this in Davos. We're well aware that there have been rules for one set of countries and rules for another set of countries. Until we get to rules for everybody and following those rules, and it's going to be very hard to convince, small and medium states that nuclear weapons aren't exactly the solution they're looking for. And then again, if that is the path we're going to be taking rather than the path of disarmament and elimination, then, we're really, really, really in trouble. We're already in trouble in the current situation. And if more countries obtain nuclear weapons, we will be in far more trouble and potentially end up in a nuclear war far more quickly. Imagine with that many players that a nuclear weapon explodes in any city, anywhere in the world, all of a sudden, the speed at which nuclear war would happen is literally minutes, because at that moment you think you may be under attack, you have to retaliate. You also have to, their technologies, for example, these intercontinental ballistic missiles, that if you think you're going to be under attack, you want to use them before they are, attacked. The missiles silos are attacked themselves. And the whole thing is it's like a powder keg. The U.S. recently had this film, A House of Dynamite, with, obviously this analogy that we're just living in a house full of dynamite that could, explode at any moment. So while I'm incredibly sympathetic to the, plight of Ukrainian people, to what they've been enduring for now almost to a day, 4-year war. This is just absolutely devastating. I do think that, the war should have never started in the first place. Of course, Russia started it, but the West is also responsible, because there could have been opportunities to negotiate for Ukraine's neutrality. This should never have been the issue of Ukraine joining NATO as a goal that was worthy of not just destroying the country, but potentially destroying the world. I think even, after Putin invaded and went into Ukraine, it is now very well documented that the April negotiations in Istanbul could have ended the war, could have prevented hundreds of thousands of deaths on both sides, millions of people leaving Ukraine, lots of, just the amount of destruction of Ukrainian infrastructure. Obviously, there have been damages on the Russian side as well, but not nearly on the same scale as in Ukraine. All of this is so devastating and to think it all could have been prevented or at least curtailed in April of 22, and that the Ukrainians were actually even willing to sign and to make the agreement with the Russians, but it was actually the Western powers that dissuaded Ukraine from proceeding. It's all so devastating. And I mean, I guess at this point, you know, it's hard to believe that we're where we are with the upcoming 4th anniversary. But I was much more optimistic even a year ago that an agreement would be reached. And at this point, I'm really concerned that this could continue for years, given the lack of, in some sense, willingness to end this peacefully and diplomatically. I hope that helps.
Yep. Thanks very much. It's very make it clear to me. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the questions. These are excellent questions and really, really important ones to consider and grapple with. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivana. So, is there anyone else have some questions for our speaker here? I would like to have one additional question for you, Ivana. So,
yes, of course.
Basically, right now, Vietnam, as well as many other small countries, we want to have like a nuclear energy, you know, like a develop nuclear reactor for the energy. So, how can we prove ourselves when we develop nuclear energy? But how can we prove ourselves when it comes to accusation of developing nuclear weapons? Is that easy to defend or?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm going to give you a personal answer, and then I'll address your specific question. I would advise. I mean, Vietnam is a warm country. I would advise Vietnam to pursue solar energy rather than nuclear energy. Nuclear energy is extremely expensive, and it carries risks that really no other energy source carries in the same way. There are risks associated with acquiring uranium. There are risks associated with running the power plants. Back in the 60s and 70s, when really it was the majority was the scientists involved in the Manhattan Project who were advocating for nuclear energy. My personal view is that many of them felt so guilty about developing nuclear weapons that they saw nuclear energy as a way of redeeming their efforts. And back then, those scientists were saying things like there will never be an accident. Like the chance of an accident is, 1 in a million years kind of thing. And of course, by 1979, the U.S. had an accident in a place called 3 Mile Island. That was an equipment malfunction accident. Then in 1986, there was Chernobyl. That was a human error accident, catastrophe, really. And then by 2011, we had Japan's Fukushima. That was really a combination, but let's say started by a natural disaster. And I think all of those examples, and we know of some also close calls in the United States, all of those examples suggest that certainly the chances of an accident are not zero, but actually rather large and serious. There's also a huge waste problem. We still don't know what to do with the radioactive waste. Some of the radioactive isotopes that are produced in nuclear energy power plants will last for hundreds of thousands of years in the environment and must be stored safely for that kind of a duration. That's just a really, really difficult task. And one that most countries that have nuclear energy have not really solved. Nowadays, really the alternative of solar, I think neighbors of yours, China, India, are developing solar at unprecedented rates. Again, I'm not an energy expert. I'm really this is not, but my sense is that solar would be something much better to invest in than nuclear energy. Now, I haven't actually followed, so I apologize for that. I don't know where things are with respect to nuclear energy in Vietnam right now. If they are proceeding and moving forward, I don't think there's a lot of concern about being able to defend what the country is doing with respect to development of nuclear weapons. Of course, Vietnam is party to the NPT. As such, it agrees to certain terms of engagement with the International Atomic Energy Agency, which can review, do inspections and review its programs and so on. The sticky point with Iran was that Iran was really, let me just acknowledge, Iran really is enriching uranium to 60%, which is far more than you need for nuclear energy, but actually not really nuclear weapons grade, although in principle you could even build a nuclear weapon with 60% enriched uranium. Clearly that's some sort of, if in fact Iran is not enriching to this level in order to build a nuclear weapon, it's some kind of a bargaining chip, I would guess. They don't have to enrich to that level. So my guess is with Vietnam, if this is the path they're pursuing in order to ensure, adequate energy supply and also energy independence, that's something that's, I think, attractive to countries about nuclear energy. If that is the path they're pursuing, I'm pretty sure Vietnam is not going to be enriching uranium to 60%. So it's probably just not a big problem. But depending on where those plans are, I do think that there are some really clear advantages to solar. Again, both in terms of energy independence as well as our ability to halt and potentially reverse some of the worst of the greenhouse gas emissions, which have been warming our planet for the last few decades.
Thank you, Ivana. So maybe one last question, and we will complete our discussion today. The last question came from Miss Nguyễn Trang. A pretty long question for you. I will read this in Vietnamese.
Great.
Từ năm 1945 đến nay đã ghi nhận bao nhiêu vụ nổ chính thức và phi chính thức từ bom hạt nhân? Các vụ nổ bom hạt nhân đó đã tác động làm thay đổi nhiệt độ trái đất như thế nào? Một trong những tác động trực tiếp của sự thay đổi nhiệt độ là sản xuất nông nghiệp. Liệu chăng sở hữu bom hạt nhân ngoài việc phô trương sức mạnh quân sự, vị thế quốc gia còn là sự ủy nhiệm đằng sau của các tập đoàn tư bản về nông nghiệp trong chiến lược kiểm soát sản xuất nông nghiệp ở các nước đang phát triển, rộng hơn là kiểm soát nền sản xuất nông nghiệp toàn cầu? Xin giáo sư giới thiệu một số dự án nghiên cứu về vấn đề vũ khí hạt nhân với an ninh lương thực. And question.
Yes, thank you so much for that question. Let me see if I can, I'm having a hard time scrolling back. Let me see. I enter. Oh, yes. I can go back to the start of the question. Let me just stay there. Oh, it keeps going back. So I think you asked how many nuclear explosions have there been since 1945 and what was the impact on the world's temperature. So we've had actually over 2,000 nuclear explosions, starting, of course, with the first one in New Mexico, the two that were actual attacks on Japanese cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and then over 2,000 more. More than 1,000 of those were conducted by the United States. All the other 8 nuclear armed states conducted, I think, about 1,000 or just about less than 1,000, with the Soviet Union conducting the most after the United States, but also some of the Soviet Union tests were even higher energy than the highest energy explosions the U.S. conducted. So in some comparisons, the U.S. did more. In some comparisons, the Soviet Union did more. The reason that those explosions didn't cause a nuclear winter on the planet is that they were always purposely done in such a way so as not to cause widespread fires. So in the Marshall Islands, for example, where the U.S. tested nuclear weapons, the U.S. only tested 67 nuclear weapons in the Marshall Islands, but the equivalent, the energy equivalent of those tests was 7,000 Hiroshima bombs. So just absolutely unimaginably high energy yields. But those were done basically over the ocean or over coral atolls. In fact, the Bravo test that I mentioned to you, which was the equivalent of 1,000 Hiroshima bombs, vaporized an entire island. But that didn't cause a fire, widespread fires that then released soot into the atmosphere. So that's the difference between nuclear testing, which also spread a lot of radioactive contamination, both locally and globally, versus nuclear war, which we expect explosions would take place over cities, military installations, forests, burnable places that could burn, as opposed to places in the Pacific. Or, for example, the Soviets did a lot of their testing either in kind of the Arctic region, or they did some of their testing in the deserts of Kazakhstan. So again, the goal was always to minimize the spread of fire, and that. Quite simply, if you're trying to destroy cities, military installations, and so on in widespread attacks, the fires would be maximized, not minimized in the nuclear war. I think the second piece had to do with agriculture and
temperature.
Yeah. So those nuclear explosions, the 2,000 that we had, we don't actually think were impacting temperature. The dominant temperature effect that we now have on the planet is the global warming due to the emissions of greenhouse gases, primarily carbon dioxide, but also things like methane. So we actually can study things like ice cores in places like Greenland and the South Pole. We can study ocean sediment. We can study tree rings. We can learn about what climate was like in the past. And we know that for basically the last, let's say 800,000 years, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere varied from about 190 parts per million to about 280 parts per million. Today, the concentration of carbon dioxide is over 420 parts per million, so far above that range, that kind of historical range in, let's say, the past million years. And carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is why our planet is livable in the first place. So that initial amount of carbon dioxide plays a key role in making sure that our planet is not just a frozen ball of ice, but actually that we have this, wonderful global temperature average of about 15 degrees Celsius. The problem is that by increasing CO2, carbon dioxide, so dramatically since the onset of the industrial age, but most prominently over the last several decades, we've also increased the temperature, and that is, having all kinds of negative impacts. That's something that needs to be addressed. But it's really, in terms of the nuclear testing, that isn't the effect. The effect we really worry about with climate is the nuclear winter. And I'll just say that one of the things that the problem of climate change and the problem of nuclear weapons, they really are intertwined, not just because they both deal with climate, but also because as climate changes and resources like water, or droughts or wildfires or, islands that are going underwater, it's all those things happen. They will increase the probability of conflicts. And that increased probability of conflicts may further lead to use of nuclear weapons in one way or the other. So the whole thing is very much, we actually really have to address both problems. And I also think that so long as our, international relations with, say, the global superpowers, the ones who do have nuclear weapons, as long as their relationships are based on threats of mutually assured destruction or threats of destruction, I think that really is going to hamper our ability to cooperate genuinely to really solve problems. Imagine if you and a neighbor have some kind of a, common problem, say, something wrong with the pipes that bring water to your homes or whatever the problem might be. If at the same time that you actually have to jointly solve that problem, if you were both pointing a gun at each other's head, the way that really the nuclear armed states are doing today with their nuclear arsenals, it would be much harder to solve whatever problem you have with the water pipes, right? So in some sense, I really see the importance of nuclear disarmament, not just in removing a threat from the world, but in also removing this way of states dealing with one another and actually recognizing that in order for us to solve the problems of today, what we really need to do is get back to genuine respect, diplomacy. Doesn't mean we'll always agree, doesn't mean we'll have the same economic systems or the same societal, organizations or cultures or any of that. It just means that we can denounce war as a means of solving problems, that we can denounce nuclear weapons as a means of keeping the peace, that we can become genuinely committed to working with one another to solve some of the real problems that our planet has. And yet it's a beautiful, beautiful planet that quite simply we are so lucky to have. And it's, contrary to what Elon Musk in the United States says about us going and searching among the stars or conquering Mars, I would put my bets on planet Earth and try to save it and preserve it, not just for us, but for all future generations.
Thank you, Ivana. The last answer is a great message for us all to keep peace this year and the year to come. And I think that is the end of our discussion today. And thank you very much for your spending time with us. And I hope to see you more in the future. And
thank you so much. It was a real pleasure to speak with all of you.
thank you, and have a nice day. Have a good night,
Thank you.
everyone.
Have a good night, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. It's very inspiring and touching.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm so happy we could all